All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How you doing?
Good.
Okay, great. Yeah, good. Must be some like sugar comas from all the Halloween candy you kept to yourself. Didn't pass out. All right, yes, good to see you. Thanks for everybody who participated in the trunk or treat. It was very cold. Not as many folks as we had last year, but I think there's some good reasons for that. But still, a lot of people came. We invited a lot of people to services, and when you do stuff, you try to invite so many people. You hope at least one or two just did, And to me, it's worth doing that kind of thing because you never know what can come of the outreach that we try to do. Okay, Ezekiel 23 is where we're at now. When I tell you to read ahead on things, I mean, you really should read ahead, not only just to prepare for the class and maybe ask questions from what's very hard to find, but sometimes you just really need read ahead so you don't get shell-shocked. And it could be the case that you have no idea what's in this chapter. You would find you're going to get a case of shell shock by what is said. What we see in this chapter is a lot of the same things that we've already been discussing. People of God have continually, for generations, centuries, have committed sin, and God is sick of it. He is done with it. He's done with their refusal to repent and come back. They are ripe for judgment. So we're not going to say a lot about those things. We're just going to read through there and we're going to see, wow, okay, here it is again. The message is clear once again, but the kind of language that gets used, especially in this chapter, that's really what I want to focus on, and that'll become clear why in just a bit. Okay, so 23, let's see, 1 through 4. So the word of the Lord came again to me saying, now what's going to come is, I guess we'll call it a parable. Technically, it might be something else. We're going to call it a parable. We're all familiar with that kind of teaching method. Son of man, verse 2, son of man, there were two women, the daughters of one mother, so they're sisters. They committed harlotry in Egypt. They committed harlotry in their youth. Now, before we even go any further, I mean, got to know who we're talking about, right? If you've been reading through Ezekiel, if you've been with us, you know who we're talking about. This is Israel. They committed adultery in Egypt. They committed harlotry in their youth. Their breasts were their embrace. Their virgin bosom was their breast. Their names, Aholah. Now, in some translations, you'll see it with an O. Sometimes you see it with an A. Aholah, the elder, and Aholibah, her sister. They were mine, God says, and they bore sons and daughters. As for their names, Samaria is Aholah, and Jerusalem is Aholibah. Aholibah? Okay. So we get this. So this is not the first time that Ezekiel has pictured Israel as a woman. In this case, it's two women and their sisters. We can go back to chapter 16, and Ezekiel's doing the same thing. He's picturing them, but there it's just one woman. Here it's two sisters. Okay, so somewhat similar. So they're pictured as two sisters who were harlots from an early age. They allowed, verse 3, they allowed others to inappropriately touch them and grope them. Really, as far as our young people today, probably not that much different, unfortunately. And really, it seems like not only did they allow this to happen, they kind of encouraged it. That's what it seems like they wanted this kind of thing. And so this ended up leading to their lives of prostitution. And this is, I think, what's going on here, throughout this chapter, I think primarily it's talking about their idolatry. Okay, so a lot of times we see this idea of harlotry or prostitution or playing the harlot with, that kind of thing, is always about them committing spiritual adultery, right? And it's about them worshiping idols. And I know a lot of other sins. So when you worship idols, you're in that whole world, and naturally you're going to be, there's quite a plethora of sins that come along with idol worship, right? And I think this is mainly about worshiping other God, but then secondary, this would be about Israel trying to make alliances with other nations instead of trusting and relying only in God. Okay, we've talked about that a number of times already. Even in Isaiah was saying, y'all should not have run to Egypt. You should not have run to Assyria. You should have stuck with it. So that's what this is about. Now, Aholah, or Aholah, means her tent, or her tabernacle. Now, in verse 4, we find out that that's Samaria. Now, that's the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And we've talked about that a number of times, northern kingdom and southern kingdom. After Solomon, it split up into those two factions, I guess, two kingdoms. All right, so we usually call that's the northern kingdom of Israel. And we have the southern kingdom of Judah. So Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. And Jerusalem was not in that part. Jerusalem was in the south. And so they had their own temple. They ended up having their own places of worship. Eventually, it was, they set up idols and their altars in other places up there, and not in Jerusalem. And so that's why Aholah means, this is what we think, means her tent. God is saying it's her tabernacle, because God's saying, I don't have anything to do with it. They build unauthorized places of worship in which they ought to be coming to Jerusalem. All right. So God never only had one temple, and he still, oddly enough, he still only has one temple today, right? So, and then Aholibah means not her tent, but my tent is in her. And talking about Jerusalem, the southern kingdom of Judah. So you see how that makes sense? Where one is her tent, and then the other one is basically my tent. Where in Jerusalem is where the temple was. This is where God wanted it to be set up, built by Solomon, and all of that. Okay. Now, for the purpose, if you look at, so there's two sisters, verse 2, and then they committed a harlotry in Egypt. Just for the purpose of the parable, Israel and Judah are being viewed kind of like separate peoples while they were in Egypt. And I don't really I hope this is not confusing. It's just for the purpose of the parable. I mean, we could think like God always knew when they were one people, they were definitely one people in Egypt, one Hebrew people. God knew in his foreknowledge, right, that they were going to come out and David was going to be king and Solomon was going to be king. And then after Solomon, he knew that eventually they were going to split into two people, into two kingdoms, right? But you might remember back in chapter 20, we think, oh, they were so good in Egypt. And, they really only started being bad until they got into the wilderness. And they made the golden calf, and that was like the beginning of the end for them. But back in verse 20, or chapter 20, starting in verse 5, I won't read that, 5 through 9, we learned that before they ever even came out of Egypt, God was condemning their sin of idolatry. They had already been wrapped up in Egyptian idolatry before Moses ever led God's people out. Okay? And of course, they carried that out with them, and it plagued them all the way up to Ezekiel's day. All right, so what was said in verse 20, or chapter 20, is kind of said here about them being kind of sinful in Egypt, and they're committing their harlotry, which would be their spiritual adultery, their sins. Okay, but despite this, you see in verse 4, here were their names, and he says, they were mine, and they bore sons and daughters. So despite what went on with them as a people in Egypt, that God was not approving of, he still chose them to be his people. He said, despite the way you were, I still wanted you to be my people. I still loved you. I wanted to protect you and make you mine and make you separate from the world, that kind of thing. It's the exact same message that Hosea preached. And if you haven't read Hosea in a while, maybe when you have time, read Hosea, a couple, maybe just the first chapter, and you're going to start to see a lot of similarities to the things that we've been talking about. And of course, this point that we're making here, where God still chose them, really echoes the great love that God has for all mankind, which was eventually seen in who? In Jesus Christ, right? Yeah. Despite how awful we were in all of our sins and the rebellion that mankind embraced, God still sent Jesus Christ to die for us. Okay, so you kind of see that here. All right. Now, 5 through 10 is about the northern kingdom. All right, so verse 5 says, Aholah played the harlot, even though she was mine, and she lusted for her lovers, the neighboring Assyrians, who were clothed in purple, captains and rulers, all of them desirable young men, horsemen riding on horses. Thus she committed her harlotry with them, all of them choice men of Assyria, and with all for whom she lusted, with all their idols she defiled herself. Verse 8, she had never given up her harlotry brought from Egypt. For in her youth they had lain with her, pressed her virgin bosom, poured out their immorality upon her. Therefore I have delivered her into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians, for whom she lusted. They uncovered her nakedness, took away her sons and daughters, slew her with the sword. She became a byword among women, for they had executed judgment on her. Okay, so long story short, the northern kingdom fell away from God, and she suffered the consequences. The people suffered the consequences. That's what this is saying here. And verse 9 is a good lesson here about God giving the people what they wanted, really. And somebody had mentioned George, what's it, Bernard Shaw? Is that right? Is there a George Bernard Shaw? Okay. I don't think he might have said this quote that I'm about to read you, but actually I think it first appeared. There's a play by Oscar Wilde called, interestingly enough, called A Play About a Good Woman. It's called Lady Windermere's Fan. Who's heard of Lady Windermere's Fan? Anybody? Oh, okay. All right, it's a play about a good woman. All right, now I haven't read it, but one of the characters in there says something like this. In this world, there are only 2 tragedies. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. The last is much the worst. The last is a real tragedy. What do I think? And so sometimes, so young, we get it, and maybe this is like a good lesson we wish we could teach our teenagers. I'll just say, I teach my boys before they have to learn out the hard way. Like, look, you think you want this thing or whatever, but man, just trust me. You don't want to go down that route, I'm sure many parents have said something like that. And then parents certainly do not get satisfaction after saying, told you so, Any good parents don't get satisfaction. So basically what happened is God gave them the people what they wanted, and she got destroyed for it. The people who she thought were their alliances and their friends and all of that, ended up destroying them. Now, this is not the first time. Well, we won't read it. It's Psalm 106, 11 through 15. God had a habit of doing this. The people just won't stop complaining. This is after they were in the wilderness. And you know how much the Israelites complained in the wilderness. Oh, we wish we were back in Egypt and where we had all this wonderful food. And basically, I'm paraphrasing. God says, you want food? I'll give you food. I'll give you so much quail, so much meat that it's going to be coming out of your nostrils. That's what it says. And then a plague. After they got all of this meat, then they were struck with a plague. So it's like Numbers. You can read it. Psalm 106 kind of sums it up, and Numbers 11 is where you read it. And so sometimes what you think you want is not actually what you want. Isn't that right? Well, and she learned the hard way, and so did her sister, the kingdom of Judah. All right. Now we're going to read 11. Are any questions so far? Go look up Lady Windermere's Fan. I'm sure it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Whatever. I mean, I hope I'm not like, actually, maybe I shouldn't endorse it. Okay, 11 through 21. All right, now, although her sister Aholibah saw this, so it's like an Asher. Oh, he's Asher sees Isaac do this thing, and it like goes really, really bad for Isaac. And Asher's like, well, it probably won't happen to me. I can probably do the same thing. Asher's not that dumb though, right? Neither is Isaac. I would hope. So it's like you see people going through this, and you see the end result, and people are like, I think I'll try that. What in the world? So this is the kind of what she does. Although her sister saw this, she became more corrupt in her lust than her sister, and in her harlotry more corrupt than her sister's harlotry. She lusted for the neighboring Assyrians, captains and rulers, clothed most gorgeously, horsemen riding on horses, all the desirable young men. Then I saw that she was defiled, both took the same way. But she increased her harlotry. She looked at men portrayed on the wall, images of Chaldeans portrayed in vermilion, girded with belts around their waists, flowing turbans on their heads, all of them looking like captains in the manner of the Babylonians of Chaldea in the land of their nativity. As soon as her eyes saw them, she lusted for them and sent messengers to them in Chaldea. So this is the idea of making alliances. Verse 17, then the Babylonians came to her into the bed of love, and they defiled her with their immorality. So she was defiled by them and alienated herself from them. She revealed her harlotry, uncovered her nakedness. Then I alienated myself from her as I had alienated myself from her sister. Verse 19, she multiplied her harlotry in calling to remembrance the days of her youth when she had played the harlot in the land of Egypt. For she lusted for her paramours, whose flesh is like the flesh of donkeys, whose issue is like the issue of horses. Thus you called to remembrance the lewdness of your youth when the Egyptians pressed your bosom because of your youthful breasts. Okay, in short, just like your sister, the northern kingdom falls away from God. And verse 22 and following, which we're going to read, shows that they too suffer the consequences, just like her sister. Now, about this language. So I read from the King James Version, the New King James, excuse me. If you go, I guess the more modern the translation, like the more, like the worse it sounds, if you can believe that. The more offensive it is, the more shocking it is. Now, skeptics, your skeptic friend, if you got one, which I bet you do, you just probably don't know it, will take this passage, especially, I hate to call out the verse, especially verse 20, and they will use this to mock the Bible as pornographic and vulgar. And then they'll open the Bible up to this, they'll read this verse to you and say, this is the Bible that you follow. How are you going to defend that? I'm telling you, it would be awkward. Even if you could defend it perfectly, it would still be awkward, wouldn't it? Now, skeptics will say, well, look at this pornography in the Bible. And the reason why they look at it like that is because that view comes from a mind who's already made a decision about the Bible. Like, even if this wasn't in here, they never discovered this before. They just know things like what Jesus says, what God says, how God says to live and things. And well, that clashes with their worldview, that clashes with their lifestyle and all of their feelings. And so because God's set of morals opposes the way that they want to live, they're already approaching the Bible with a bias. And so when they find something like this, they're like, see, I knew it. I knew I didn't follow this thing for a reason. Okay. So how do we answer this? And I'm not saying that, well, one, I'm not saying you will ever talk to anybody about this. Probably not if you don't ever talk to anybody about the Bible at all. But especially anyone who doesn't really believe in God. But more and more people are not believing in God. And so chances are, our young people, you probably got more, I bet you if we asked just our couple young people here, if you have more skeptics, let's just call them skeptics, than actual real Christian friends, they have way more non-religious friends. And I'm not saying Christian, not what I mean is they at least like an actual faithful Christian, not someone who just says, yeah, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus.
That same reality was then as it is now. It's not like, that kind of sin was going on then. I mean, now and not then.
What do you mean, like, what kind of sin?
The harlotry and.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, the literal harlotry?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they would have known. It's like Ezekiel, the people who are listening to this, they know what he's saying. They know that it's a parable or metaphor. They know it's that, but they also know why it's making such an impact on them. They get the message that he's saying. So
I'm saying people that would, speak about God's word and say, here's pornography.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Do they not realize that was going on then?
True, yeah. Now? True, yeah. Just, I guess, a different format, I guess, right?
If they didn't know that it was a parable, what you were saying.
Yeah. I imagine someone could have grabbed a hold of Ezekiel's writings and then mocked the Bible, mocked the scriptures, for sure. Yeah, and then the Jews were, you have to defend it. They'd have to defend it. Okay, so what do we do about this? I'm just curious if anyone knew that this kind of thing was in the Bible. I'm curious. Did you have any idea? Like, you don't read Ezekiel very often, I'm sure, because it's just, we don't. And maybe that's our problem. That's why we don't read the whole Bible. Okay. Yeah, I know. I guess it's embarrassing. Like, I wouldn't want to talk about it either. A little awkward, huh? So
look at it just like you did when you said it was a parable. Jesus put things in terms that they could understand.
Yeah.
They knew what it,
Yeah.
And Ezekiel's done the same thing. This is going on, so you know what this means, and this is what you're doing to your country and to your God.
Yeah.
He put it in terms they would understand.
True. Granted, yes. Granted, Jesus didn't put it in terms like this.
No, different situation.
And so, which is why we have to address this kind of thing. This is quite different from like sowing seed, don't you think? Or what do you call it? A man leaving his kingdom, whatever. All right, so here's the thing. Ezekiel spoke to, we're talking about, I don't think we realize just how stubborn and hard-hearted the Israelites were. I'm hoping that this is the chapter who's going to finally realize, like, whoa, they were that far gone. That he spoke to very stubborn, and more importantly, to our point here, they were completely desensitized to their sins. Really hard-hearted. We go back to Jeremiah 6:15, where Jeremiah, remember, preaching alongside Ezekiel in just a different place, who was saying that people forgot how to blush because of the sins that they were committing. And we know that, but do we realize like how bad off the people were? Ezekiel 2, let's see, let me go back, read Ezekiel 2:4. This is God, so Ezekiel's getting the call, right? He's like, God is telling Ezekiel what he's in for. Ezekiel 2 in verse 4. God is saying about Israel. He says, for they are impudent and stubborn children. I'm sending you to them, and you shall say to them, thus says the Lord God, as for them, whether they hear or whether they refuse, for they are a rebellious house, yet they will know that a prophet has been among them. Look, rebellious should be in like bold, cap, underline, italicized words. They were completely desensitized. And so if you got a hard heart, if you know someone who's got a hard heart, and you try to talk to them about, let's say, coming back to services, being faithful again, or whatever it might be, maybe it doesn't have to be religious, to have a hard heart. You know how hard it is to talk to those people. And so if a hard heart is ever going to be broken, and we don't really know whether it's going to be broken or not, really only that person and God knows. Well, at least God knows. But if that hard heart is ever going to be broken or softened up, then it needs to be hit just as hard, right? Well, that makes sense to me. And this kind of shocking sexual imagery was intended to do that. Now, if I understand addiction correctly, what happens in addiction is the denial, right? You got to get past the denial phase of it if you're ever going to beat your addiction. And so to break a pattern of denial, showing compassion to the person who is addicted means giving very hard and sometimes very hurtful truths. Sometimes that's the only thing that's gonna wake them up, get them out of it. From what I know, which is very little, about behavioral psychology, it's the same kind of thing, same kind of principles. It's called pattern interruption. Pattern interruption is used to break people's bad habits. And so the idea is to it's like I picture my grandparents for some reason like shaking me for some, but it's like you're trying to shake someone into, you've heard the phrase, I just want to shake them, maybe that's what it was. That's my grandparents. My grandma would always say, oh, you just want to shake them. But the idea is to jar a person out of their harmful habits and their harmful lifestyle, and so they can get past it and start to being better. What I'm saying is that it's at least plausible that this is what God is doing here through Ezekiel by using this kind of language. Does that make sense? Okay. Because the language shocks us, and it's good. I tell you, it's very good that it shocks us. I hope it does shock you, because sin should be shocking to us as well. When I'm tempted to go into this sin or something, I'm hoping that something in my brain is telling me just how bad this is going to be if I give into this particular temptation or whatever. And when we hear about someone, committing adultery, or, some young kids on drugs, getting strung out on drugs, trying drugs for the first time, you're like, oh, or sleeping with their boyfriend and girlfriends, or someone going on a drunk bender, or whatever it is. We shouldn't just be like, a lot of times we're just like, because we've heard it so many times. In a way, we're desensitized to it. We've heard like, oh man, we hate that. But it should, and I think I said this the other day, it should floor us. Like, unbelievable that this particular person has done this particular thing. And it ought to shock us, and it ought to hurt us. Because sin is that bad. And I don't know how we break we break the level of desensitized. I don't know how we break our problem with it, because we hear it so often, right? We hear about sin so often, and we see it sometimes family members, sometimes on the news, and we get desensitized to it, and we start viewing sin as a little more tolerable. And we can't do that. I don't know how to I don't know how to stop that. We can't hold ourselves up in the world I think if we just cut off the internet, I bet it would help. Prove me wrong with that one. Go ahead.
I was looking at it from God's side too, maybe a jarring how he feels. It's so horrible, that these two that are mine, sisters or children, or
Yeah.
That gives his perspective, his point of view, of how horrible it is to him. Because we are desensitized and maybe, oh, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah.
They're doing it, everybody's doing it, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah.
And he's showing what a big deal it is.
Huge deal, yeah.
Because they took their trust away from him and put it in the hands of basically strangers who looked powerful and they looked, tempting to be useful to them.
Yeah.
Captains, I think was mentioned.
Yeah. That's the idea. You see them walk on their horses and how beautiful they would have looked and how strong. And he's talking about their military. Remember, this is not actual, I'm sure they did commit literally adultery with these people, but at some point, right? You gotta think they did, but it's really about them making alliances, thinking that they are better than God. And seeing their belts around, like turbans on their head, they look so awesome, and all they got with God is like an ark. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and God has every right to be as jealous as He is. So now we have folks, and maybe you have thought this. Well, something like, well, God didn't have to say it like that. A holy book shouldn't have such things in it. How else is God going to get his point across of how vile and disgusting sin is to him and how deeply wounded and hurt, how he was saying, and how disappointed he is when a people whom he chose becomes unfaithful to him. And anyone who would say, any Christian who would say, well, holy book shouldn't have that in there, I would ask how they would have written it. How would you have written it? It's one thing to say, well, that's not right, it shouldn't be in there. Well, then give us another way that it should have been written. Give us something else. You go all the way back to Exodus and everything. You just compile everything that has ever been said about, God has said about the seriousness of sin. Moses all the way through the prophets. What would you have written on top of all of that? And the people are still don't care. So what would you have written that would hopefully get the people to kind of wake up from their spiritual coma? How would you have written it? Go ahead.
I was going to say Genesis 19 has a lot of crazy stuff in it.
Yeah, and that is and that's with the incest and all that, and that's I guess recorded somewhat different than here, but that's not easy to read either. And there's more than that. And talking about Lot with his $2, and so that's recorded history. This is something where I could see some Christians saying, well, we could have just skipped over that. Didn't have to put it like that.
He's already, I'm guessing the timeline here, the children in the wilderness, the majority, the old ones, never got to see that Canaan. They never got to see anything good.
Yeah.
Because of their evilness. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. He's, the ones that didn't go on the ark, he's already showed them his wrath. They're not listening.
Yeah. So the scriptures are divine and they are holy. And this is surprising to maybe see something like this in here, but part of holiness includes calling out the evil of sin. You got to expose the evil of sin. And so hiding it or shoving it under the rug or handling it with kid gloves is not going to do it. Now, unfortunately, our highly sexualized culture probably causes all of us to look at this differently than it would have been looked at by the Jews, I think. Now, skeptics and atheists and this and that who don't really have a good set of morals probably get pleasure from reading like sexual stories and things like that, which is not, I mean, I don't think, I mean, this is my personal opinion, Christians who read like romance novels that have kind of like, what do we call it? Smut? Is that a bad word? Smut inside of it, like where you have, probably should stay away from that kind of thing. And which is why I've always thought the soap operas are not something that I would find normally think that I would see on a Christian television. But skeptics and atheists, people with no really morals, they get pleasure from reading maybe stuff somewhat maybe not as crazy as this. And they know that when they know that the Bible would condemn them reading and looking and viewing at things of a sexual nature. And so when they flip open the Bible and they see something like this, that something that they might normally indulge in or make a joke about or find funny, boom, it's their chance to mock it and mock you and mock the church and everything about it. I think back then, let's see, where we at? Back then, this kind of language, I think, would have shocked even Israel. As bad off as they were, I think sometimes sin can shock even the ungodliest of people. I think people get deep into sin, no doubt, but you gotta hope and pray that people still have some kind of limits, right? I think in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse number 1, there was a sin going on in the church, and Paul says this kind of sin is not even heard about among the Gentiles. The Gentiles don't even do this kind of thing. Well, they certainly weren't Christians, but they didn't go that far, and here are Christians doing it. So if Ezekiel's words were kind of all cleaned up and all respectable, then it really would have watered down the truth about how horrible the people's sins really were. The language serves two purposes. One, it's for moral clarity. It's in here for moral clarity. It's to get the reader, then and today, to see that sin, which by the world's idea of sin, dressed up very beautifully, very pleasurable, is to get the reader to see that sin is absolutely disgusting when it is exposed for what it is. All right, that's number one. And then number two, this kind of language anticipates the severity of the judgment. So the more vivid the description of the sin, that prepares the hearer's mind when they hear about how awful the judgment is going to be. And they're like, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense, If this section was written for entertainment, or if this was just a man of God who's just writing down his view of poetry, the skeptics and the atheists, they would be absolutely justified in using this to mock the Bible. But that's not how this was written. It was not written for those reasons at all. I think these words, and this makes a lot of sense to me, that these words were chosen precisely because they do offend. Everybody who reads this, when Ezekiel's people heard it, they should have been offended. When we read it, we should be offended by it. We should be embarrassed. It should be awkward. We should hate this. Because we hate sin. This is how bad sin is. I remember, I'm going to say a couple more things and we'll stop here. College freshman year, we took a class called, I don't even know what it's called. I'll tell you how my college went. It was the easiest class. It was like, hey, introduction to college, kind of stupid stuff. And I got C in it. Oh boy. So anyways, they filed us all the freshmen into one of the big auditoriums, and they showed us graphic pictures of sexually transmitted diseases. And I'll never forget it. Because obviously, guess what young people want to do when they're away from their home and they're around, it's a very sexually charged environment. I guess probably our high schools are that way now, but back then, college was like it. And so to prevent us from, basically fornicating with everything that moved, they were showing us just how bad it can be if you mess around with people that you should not be messing around with. And it was meant to shock us into submission, basically, scare us half to death, which I think it did for a lot of people, not for most, but anyways. Don't you think that's this is meant to shock the people? If a doctor describes a diseased organ to a patient in very graphic terms, maybe even uncomfortable terms, is that vulgar when he does that? It's not. It's just the truth being told as plainly as possible. And there's nothing different with this language right here. Okay, time is up. If you had comments, we can pick it back up next time. If not, we'll finish the chapter and get into the next one. Thanks, everybody. The Bible writers refer to the scriptures as the words of God over and over and over and over again. For example, 20 out of 27 chapters in the book of Leviticus has the phrase, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying," and then everything that is said is attributed to God saying it. Now, so Moses is the messenger, God is the revealer of all of it. Psalm 119, the psalmist there continually refers to the scriptures as coming from the Lord or belonging to the Lord. In the New Testament, Galatians 1, 11 through 12, Paul says, "The gospel that was preached by me is not according to man. I neither received it from men, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ." He says somewhat the same thing to the Thessalonian church, where he says that everything that he was saying and everything that he was teaching and writing down to them in his letters was, quote, "by the word of the Lord." We can go back to Old Testament again, David, 2 Samuel 23 and verse 2, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, his word was on my tongue." And so we can keep going on and on and on and on about that, the claims that the Bible makes that it is not from man, it is from God. But what proof do we have that is going to convince the open-minded person, and we still want to believe that there are still open-minded people out there today? What proof do we have that would convince them that the Bible is really the literal, the error-free Word of God? And what we're going to try to do in answering that is to begin by looking at one little sliver of the medical accuracy that is found in the Old Testament. Now, we do this knowing that some people, no matter what I say, no matter what they hear, no matter what they read that makes any kind of sense, they're going to reject it regardless. They're going to reject any kind of argument, even any kind of evidence that shows the Bible to be at least a very unique book, and that it's not like the other religious texts that are out there. No matter how sound the argument is, no matter how valid the argument is, some people they just don't want to hear it. And it's because accepting the Bible as true means accepting the Bible as authority, as their authority, as in it means to be held responsible to live by it. That's what that means. And this is something that people have just kind of resolved, or they've resigned themselves to never do, no matter what. Because it feels like God would be stripping them of some kind of free will or some kind of autonomy or something like that. But, so we say this knowing that people are going to go boom and turn this off, or not even really give it a second thought. But we also know that there are a whole lot of people out there who may not really would say, "I believe in a God," but they are still searching. And as I think a lot of folks, they have not hardened their hearts to the idea of a belief in one true God. And then there are a third category of people who do believe in God, would call themselves Christian, but that belief is slowly fading away for a number of different reasons. And so this lesson is for those people too. Because, if it's true that the belief system of Christianity that we have held on to for so long is really, when you get down to it, it's very wishy-washy at its core. And no real proof can be given for the Bible's divine inspiration, the Bible's divine uniqueness. kind of makes Christianity really nothing more than a house of straw, and worse, something that's built upon sand. And if that's the case, then it's time for all of us to give it up, and we've been wasting our time. But if there is a supreme intelligent being out there who did create the human race and everything around them, and if that supreme being, God, has an interest in what mankind is doing and where mankind is going, then it makes really good sense that he would also communicate with them, communicate with us in some way. And that way of communication have to be something that is enduring and incorruptible. That it's got to be some kind of objective standard that everybody, all mankind could learn from and understand. And it could not be something that would depend upon our shifting feelings, our dreams, and our, I guess, temporary so-called miracles. No, it would have to be something that can be preserved, examined, and verified by generation after generation after generation. In other words, it makes really good sense that our God would give us a divinely inspired written revelation like the Bible. And not just give it to us for us to blindly believe, but give us something that contains within itself the evidence that, yes, indeed, it does have God's fingerprints all over it. Now, before we get into, we're eventually going to Genesis 17. Before we get there, we want to make sure that we understand the Bible is not a medical journal. It's never written to be a medical journal, and it never claims to be a medical journal, and that's not what we're claiming this morning. However, if it is the case that the Bible is from God, then it is going to be absolutely correct on everything that we read in it. And maybe a better way to put it is that the Bible is never going to be wrong about anything it speaks on. The Bible's never going to be wrong about anything it speaks on. We want to maybe word it that way, and it almost kind of sounds like I just repeated myself, just different words. But I think we should word it that way because someone's argument is always going to be that the Bible is not 110% accurate, or it's not 110% complete on XYZ subject. For example, let's say, now it doesn't do this, but let's just say, hypothetically, the Bible were to give a method of setting a broken bone. All right? It doesn't do that. As far as I know, it doesn't do that. But let's just say it did. And let's say that method, when we were to put it into practice, hey, it actually works. It's pretty effective. Someone would inevitably come along and say, well, but the Bible didn't say, it didn't give the proper casting technique, and it didn't give the correct rehabilitation that should follow, and the correct use of sterile dressings, and on and on and on and on. You see the argument? Well, it doesn't say everything about it. But that kind of objection misses the entire point. The claim of divine inspiration does not require that the Bible say every single thing about a subject. Divine inspiration only requires that whatever the Bible does say to be true. It's got to be true. So imagine let's say you were describing an elephant to someone who had never seen an elephant, not even a picture. They just hear the word, they know it's an animal, they have no idea what an elephant looks like. And you say, okay, well, this is easy. It's huge, it's big, it's way up here, and it's gray, and it's got big, humongous, floppy ears, and it's got this big old long trunk for a nose. And the person's like, wow, okay, I can kind of see that. Wow, that's weird, but yeah, that's pretty neat. But then someone's overhearing you say that, and they come along and they say, no, well, you didn't mention that it had a small tail, relative to its trunk, and you didn't mention that it has 4 legs, and you didn't mention that they have big ivory tusks that can grow out, and you didn't mention how tough the skin is, and et cetera, et cetera. Is what you initially said about the elephant wrong? No, you were exactly right. Do you see the argument that people would make? It's like almost people just want to argue just to argue. So the Bible's purpose is not to be a medical journal. It was never meant to be this huge, exhaustive encyclopedia on astronomy and oceanography and biology and geology and the like. But as a revelation from God himself, it is going to be entirely reliable on the things that it does talk about, and that would include anything related to medicine. Okay. Now, a little something about Moses' education. It's common knowledge, and of course, don't you know, people argue about this too, but it's common knowledge that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Moses was also raised and educated in Egypt, but he did not grow up like in some poor Egyptian town on the outskirts of a big major city where he struggled his whole life, to get through. He was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, made him Pharaoh's grandson, so to speak. So that means he would have had access to the finest teachers that their schools had to offer. He would have been able to meet and learn from all the dignitaries that would have been traveling in to meet with Pharaoh and trade with the country and all of that. And maybe most important, as far as our subject today is concerned, Moses would have had access to the best doctors around. He probably would have been able to question them and watch how they work and maybe read their journals and read their documentation and all of that. And so it's no wonder in Acts 7 and verse 22, Stephen says in his preaching, he says about Moses that he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And surely that would have included their medical practices. Now, what about their medical practices? There was an Egyptian papyrus document found in 1872, and it contains like 800 plus prescriptions of all kinds. You want to make a little cream in a bandage and whatever. And while some of the prescriptions do seem to be somewhat helpful, a majority of the things that they practiced did way more harm than good. Most of them are pretty disgusting for me to say from the pulpit. In fact, we're actually going to be having a meal afterwards. If you want to talk about all the disgusting things, then we have food on all our plates. Probably a perfect time to do that. But compared to modern medicine, a conservative estimate might be something like only 30 to 50% of those 800 plus prescriptions are just partially effective, which makes a lot of them no good at all. Now, the thing is that Moses, is it too much of a stretch to say that Moses would have been familiar with a lot of that? He was much learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he didn't include any of those harmful things in the things that he wrote in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, you would naturally think, well, of course, he's going to put into what the people should be practicing, the things that he was so used to, but he didn't do that. Why is that? Because he wrote by God's direction, and God knew that the Egyptian medicine was hardly accurate, hardly helpful, and so what did God do? He gave the Israelites things that would actually benefit them. Now, in Genesis 17 and verse 12, we're going to look at the example of circumcision. Now, this is really all we're going to look at today, just this. Genesis 17 and verse 12. Here we find God instituting circumcision as the covenant sign for his people. So here's what verse 12 says of Genesis 17. He who is 8 days old, and that's pretty important, we're going to come back to that. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male in your generations. He who is born in your house, bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. Verse 13. He who is born in your house, and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised. My covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And verse 14 basically says the same thing. If the male is not circumcised, then he is not part of the covenant. God's going to consider that he's broken the covenant, actually. Okay, so in that passage, there's a lot of little things, a lot of nuances that, would probably drum up some questions that we can discuss at another time. But what we're focusing on is just the specific command of circumcision and that it was done on the 8th day. Now, this was told to Abraham. First told to Abraham, it's the first time you see it, Genesis 17. It was kept by his descendants, so Isaac, and all through Jacob, and throughout the entire time the Hebrews were in Egypt, they did this. You can read Exodus 4, Exodus 12 to see that, they must have been keeping this up the whole time. After the Exodus, after Moses goes in and says, let my people go, and they come out into the wilderness, the command was given in the law of Moses. That's Leviticus chapter 12 and verse number 3. And there, the 8-day time frame is repeated. All right, so Genesis 17, circumcised on the 8th day. Leviticus 12, many years later, circumcised on the 8th day. So what we're going through this is to say that it was well established, a well-established medical practice among the Israelites, and it had been for a few hundred years, all the way up to being repeated in the law of Moses. Now, before we get to the 8th day thing, I think this is extremely important. Circumcision for Israelite babies was what I want to call countercultural. And all we mean by that is that it was against the cultural norm. In other words, no one was really doing this like they were. 3 reasons. It was countercultural because of its timing. So it was done on the 8th day of life. Egyptians absolutely practiced circumcision. Some Canaanite tribes practiced it. African tribes practiced it back then, but not on babies. They only did it on pre-adolescent or adolescence and like a right into manhood, or you do it before you're married or in adulthood for whatever reason. That we don't have any evidence that anybody else practiced this on babies in that time period. But guess who did? Israel. Well, that's just at least, isn't that just interesting? At least it's interesting. Here's the second thing, it's countercultural because Israelite circumcision had theological significance behind it. It is thought, we don't even really know, but it's thought that other cultures did it for fertility beliefs and initiation rites and things like that. Only the Israelites that we know of connected it to a covenantal relationship to their God, and they connected it to moral obedience. In fact, it went far deeper into some spiritual meaning for them because God demanded that they also circumcise their hearts. Deuteronomy 10 in verse 16. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can't do that physically, spiritually you can. The idea is there to cut away with all of their sins and devote themselves solely to God. The best thing that historians have come up with for the reasons behind, for example, why the Egyptians practiced circumcision amounts to this, quote, "No well-accepted theory explains the significance of it to the Egyptians." We've got some reliefs on the wall. You can look up where Egyptians actually drew themselves carrying out the practice, which is just kind of weird in itself. But really, we're just looking at this thing and we're just trying to figure out why they even did it. And our best guess is, well, they did it for maybe some initiation things, some fertility things, which probably had something to do with their gods. But we really don't know. And the same unanswered questions exist for every other civilization in that area and every other culture in that area who practiced it. Yet here we open up the Bible and it tells us exactly why Israel was doing it. All right, third reason it was countercultural was because it was universal. For all Israelite males, for Egyptians, we think it was only for the priests. It was only for the upper class in society, only upper class males, like some kind of weird privilege, which, no thanks. But for the Israelites, every male baby had it done because every male Israelite, quote, belonged to God, because they were his people. And so what we have is in form, in the sense of that it's on the 8th day, in form, in meaning, and in scope, the command of circumcision for the Israelites was countercultural. Now, we're laying this point out because this is a theme for the things that the Israelites practiced. They did things in ways that nobody else around them did. Why? Why is that? Why are they the weird ones? Why are they standing out? Their practices, which we would say, the Bible says, derived from God himself, are the things that set them apart from other peoples and nations that surrounded them, which is exactly what God wanted for them. Now, about this 8th day. Why circumcise on the 8th day? It's a well-established scientific fact that newborns are born with very low vitamin K levels. That's why you get the vitamin K shot. And what this means is that newborns have very low levels of vitamin K dependent blood clotting factors, including Big words like prothrombin, okay? It's the only time I'm gonna say that, D. There's actually a documented case where they were trying to get this practice, a more modern day practice of this, I think in the East somewhere, and they have a documented case where an infant bled for 90 minutes straight after the circumcision procedure. And the doctors finally were like, what's going on? And they finally figured out, oh, he hadn't received the standard vitamin K shot. And so they quickly gave him like 2 milligrams of of the shot, and the bleeding stopped in 30 minutes. And so the blood clotting system in the human body is pretty important, right? And so once newborns come out of the mother's womb and they start feeding, they start eating actually some physical food here, their body starts producing all the gut bacteria and all the things that they need to produce the things that they need. Okay. Some apologists, you look this up, some Christian apologists, actually many Christian apologists, will say that that day 8 is the singular perfect day in the baby's entire life that clotting factor levels spike to over 100% of the normal level. All right, so they're very low at first, and then they spike a little bit, like one day, and then they start dropping, and then they shoot back up on day 8, and it's like 110, 120%, something like that. And so if you're going to medically cut a baby, well, then that's the perfect day to do it. And apologists will say, God knew that. It's the only day in their life, they say, that happens. And most people are going to cite a chart from a 1984 book, which happened to be written with a Christian bias. It's a doctor with a Christian background, so he wrote the book in that way. I think it's interesting. It's more than interesting that among the who knows how many medical journals that are out there and that have been printed from, like, let's just say the 50s all the way up to today, you're only going to find this chart in this one book. And it's called None of These Diseases, if you're interested. And it's the reference that the book gives for the chart, saying that, well, this is the way it is. The reference is extremely hard to find, so hard to find. I couldn't find it. Now, that's probably not saying much, but if you can find it, I would love to see it. And so what I'm saying is this, that all these apologists are saying, well, day 8, it spikes to this. But you can't really back it up. It's really hard to back it up with like really solid evidence. And to me, that makes it suspect. And I want to use this moment, just an opportunity just to, hey, like when you see something written out there by some people who, you know, at least have some PhDs behind their name or whatever, if they're members of the church, they would want you to check behind them, all right? But just don't believe everything. Don't believe anything that you read. Do the research yourself. Does the vitamin K thing spike it over 100% only on the 8th day in a human being's life? Probably not. At least it's a little suspect to me. But you know what? We don't need that chart. We don't need that chart. We don't need the chart because we can look up many other things that says on day 7, 8, 9, and 10, every normally, you know, I guess if things are going normal for them, the baby's clotting system is at or near adult levels. Well, hey, then that's all you need. That makes it the perfect time to perform minor procedures. Now, here's the thing. You say, well, that's not really great. It's kind of maybe coincidence. The fact that nothing like this exists in what we read in the Bible, in any ancient writings, as old as Genesis, that speaks volumes. We would say something like the silence is deafening. The command in Genesis and Leviticus is culturally distinct. It is medically optimal, and it is theologically rooted. And so if someone's going to come up and tell me that Moses just happened to record it right, I don't think so. That Abraham probably just discovered this method by accident. No. Or by trial and error. They finally figured out the best method. No. What makes the most sense, like it or not, is that this was instructed by the one who created the human body and knew the best time to circumcise the male child. What do you think about that? That's interesting. I have an objection here, and I wasn't going to do the objection, but it's not quite midnight yet, so. Don't you know that if you were to present this to somebody who didn't really believe the Bible, they would be like, well, yeah, but, right? There's a lot of objections that the skeptics bring up. I'm going to talk very quickly just about the one thing, the one objection that I think is the strongest. And it's about that trial and error thing. This is what you would present all of this, and then they would say, well, it looks like it's just a product of human experimentation. Because any society that would be experiencing with early circumcision, they're going to discover by observation that the early procedures on day 1, 2, and 3, something like that, well, they bleed a lot more than they do in the other days. And so the assumption is, well, the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, they just experimented or they observed certain outcomes over a time period, and they eventually found out that, hey, day 8 works the best. And so they say, Genesis 17, that's not divine revelation. That's just discovery by trial and error. And what do we say to that? Well, first we would say that Genesis 17 certainly doesn't present it that way, right? Circumcision is presented as a command given directly to a man, Abraham. It was to be practiced immediately, like right away, which he and his family did, if you read a little further in the chapter. So nothing in the text even remotely suggests that it developed over time as a custom or a tradition. There's no time allowed in the Bible for a learning curve. And again, no ancient texts, including the Bible, suggests that the Israelites were a medically experimenting civilization like we know the Egyptians were. So you want to get a favorable outcome from trial and error experiments, it's going to take some time. And I would say to get to where you have a safe standard to be practiced from then on out, it's going to take generations, maybe, at least some decades, and some detailed record keeping, and a willingness to risk the lives of little babies. Now, the latter makes no sense whatsoever, considering y'all know what the promise that was made to Abraham was, right? His descendants were going to be like the sands on the seashore, Genesis 22:17. Well, pretty hard to facilitate that promise when you're killing all your offspring because you're just trying to get this little procedure right. And also, you've got to remember how counter-cultural Israelite practices were. If trial and error is what produced the 8th day method, we would expect all the other cultures, all the nearby civilizations to at least come to a similar conclusion, yet no other ancient culture independently settled on any day in infancy, much less an 8th day, as this general rule. This is when we're going to circumcise our baby boys. This is exclusively Hebrew, and that supports divine revelation, and it goes against this idea of human testing and observation. Okay, we'll stop there. This subject alone is not the one, we're not saying that this is it, a book closed, we have proved the inspiration of the Bible. That's not really what we're saying, but to ignore the things that we've talked about this morning, or to wave them off as if, well, they don't really mean anything, that is not intellectually honest. I would say it's pretty compelling evidence that at least begins to point us to the Bible being divinely inspired. And I gotta say that what we've talked about is really just scratching the surface. There's a whole lot more medically and scientifically accurate passages just like this. And so truly, all scripture is given by inspiration of God, 2 Timothy 3 and verse 16. The invitation is open if you need to respond to it. Would you like to know more about what to do to make sure that you're going to heaven? The Bible lays it out very, very clearly. Many of us here have discovered that we were lost at some point in our life, and we thought we were saved the whole time, but when we found out what the Bible says, we did what Jesus Christ wanted us to do. You can join them in doing that. We'd love to study with you. If there's any sin that needs to be repented of by any member of the church here, and if you need to do it in a public way, now's your time. You're in the midst of people who love you and care for you. And there's no better group of people to have to pray for you. And also knowing that God is welcoming you back with open arms, only when you're ready to come. And of course, you don't want to wait until it's too late. Let's grab our songbooks and stand and sing together.